Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to intro the nervous system, and we're going to go through the basics of nerve cells, neurons, basic structures inside a neuron. We're going to look at the different parts of the nervous system. There's different levels of it, and then that'll kind of finish this lecture. Our next lecture after that will go into how a neuron depolarizes and how it creates what we call an action potential. Okay, so the nervous system is going to play a huge role in the body, and we could probably make an argument that the nervous system really is the brains or the communicator for other systems in the body. When we talk about skeletal muscle, the endocrine system, even bone, cardiovascular, even to an extent the immune system, nervous system nerves play a huge role in communication in initiating responses from those systems. As we know, that when it comes to us and our movement, our reactions, our actions, that the nervous system plays a role in reacting to stimuli, whether that's physical, something we step on, whether that's temperature, whether it's sound, sights, things like that. The nervous system plays a role in our engagement, our interaction with the outside environment. So a good way to kind of think about the nervous system is to consider it divided into parts. And we're going to tackle each of these parts as we go through. So as you see, the nervous system, we could say, is divided into the central and the peripheral nervous system. So central being our brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral system being everything else. Anything else is nervous tissue that's outside the central nervous system. That'll be other nerves in the arms, legs, that send messages to and from the central nervous system. And that's key because a lot of what we'll talk about in this class relates to the peripheral nervous system. When we talk about how signals go to muscles to get them to contract, we're talking about peripheral. We're talking about motor units, we're talking about peripheral. And so let's take that and expand that a little bit. When we look at peripheral, we often divide that into what's called somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Now, somatic, this is largely what we'll cover when we talk about muscle. Somatic is when we send messages to and from muscles, those are two muscles, motor units, motor neurons, to get them to contract. And it's also sensory information that's going to come back to the central nervous system. So that's somatic. We often say somatic is voluntary. In other words, those are systems, those are aspects of the nervous system that are underneath our control. Otherwise, we have the autonomic nervous system, and we often call these autonomic because they're involuntary. And a lot of actions that the nervous system engages in, it does without our, cognitive control, and that's something we realize. Subdivisions of that will be sympathetic and parasympathetic, and we'll get a little more in depth in that later on. But basically, sympathetic and parasympathetic act to collectively maintain homeostasis in various body systems. And so we generally say sympathetic engages the body, arouses the body, gets us to engage in action, and parasympathetic is often the opposite, and engages in action, calm, sleep, things like that. And like I said, we'll go way more in depth as we go on later in each of these. But know these systems, know that we're going to hang out in somatic for most of this class. And the next few slides just kind of pinpoint this a little more directly. I'm not going to ask you to know what different nerves are, be able to name them. You'll do that in the lab. Just understand more the difference between these groups and then the subdivisions of the peripheral being somatic, autonomic, and then with that, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, so that gets us to the structure of a neuron. And so let's just kind of look at a neuron here. And now, not all neurons exactly look like this. Some are shorter, some are longer. Again, this is an animated perspective, but neurons, clearly, as you can see from their shape, different than a normal cell. Often we think of cells, we think of a nice, pretty circle. We have all the organelles inside and cytoplasm and all these. Neurons do not look like that. And again, the function of a cell dictates its structure. And so as we see here, neurons are generally long, quite long. In fact, you can have neurons up to a couple of feet long. Neurons have a cell body here where there's a nucleus, and that'll usually be on one end of a neuron. On that end, there'll be various dendrites that are making connections with other cells, other systems, things like that. Inside the soma, we also have, even though it's not on here, there is endoplasmic reticulum, there is Golgi apparatus, there are the proteins there. Then it's not drawn, but they are there. Then down this neuron, we have what's called the axon, which is the length of this neuron. And this is, the axon is where, when we talk about an action potential and depolarization, that's where this is going to occur. We'll tackle that in the next lecture. And then this ends into the terminal section, the axon terminal of a neuron. This is where this neuron will make interactions. It might be with a muscle cell, where these buttons would form a synapse with muscle cells. It could be some other type of tissue, some other type of cell. And here we might have neurotransmitter that's released. And so this is our basic structure. Now, with the axon, there's also some other unique features here that we don't see in other cells. One is what we call a Schwann cell. And a Schwann cell are these cells that kind of surround the axon at various points. And they help to create what we call this myelin sheath. And what a myelin sheath literally is a Schwann cell wrapped around this axon. One, to protect it, which is really key. And in fact, this myelin sheath plays a very, very large role in neuron function. In diseases where the myelin sheath starts to deteriorate, like multiple sclerosis, that has a dramatic effect on neuron function. You can't send nerve impulses down the neuron as well as quickly, and because of that, that'll greatly affect how neurons function. And so having these Schwann cells and myelin sheath there protecting the neuron is very, very important. These also cause these little gaps right there. Gap, gap, gap. Those gaps are called the nodes of Ranvier. Gotta love that. You have to say it that way. The nodes of Ranvier we'll talk about more when we get to the action potential. But these also play a role not so much in protecting a neuron. They play a role in helping to propagate action potentials down this neuron. In other words, it allows neuron messages to go much more quickly down this axon. Okay, and again, here's another picture of this. Now we're seeing a neuron act with, in this case, another neuron. So we have a neuron here, a neuron here. There's a synapse. You can't see that. Just understand that, yeah, you have neurons that may interact with other neurons. Interneurons do that in the spinal cord. We see this in other parts of the brain as well, where we have one neuron causing a synapse with another neuron, and then that's sending a signal to wherever that would go. And this is just kind of a picture. This is more of a microscopic picture here of our neuron. Obviously, we have our cell body. Here's a dendrite, the axon traveling down, nucleus, nucleolus. These have one nucleus, a little different than muscle cells. And so again, just kind of give us a picture here of the basic function, basic structure of neurons. Now, these myelin sheath are key because they play a role, as we mentioned before, in surrounding these neurons. And clinically, these are really, really important. And in fact, you have neurons like motor neurons, which have an extensive myelin sheath. We would say they're myelinated neurons. Myelinated axons. Right? You also do have in your body, in your what we call gray matter, particularly in your brain, we do have unmyelinated axons. Now, there's actually value at times to having unmyelinated axons as well. These send messages a little bit slower, but there are times where we want these axons to send messages at a slightly slower rate, much less than myelinated axons. We wouldn't want, an axon traveling to your foot to kick a soccer ball. We wouldn't want that to be unmyelinated. It would be very slow. You wouldn't be able to perform that exercise, that activity quickly. But in the brain, sometimes we do want some of this to be slower. We want these axons to be able to receive other input, other stimuli from other neurons, other inner neurons, to which then a response could be a little bit slower. And so just understanding this myelin sheath plays a large role, just gives us kind of a picture of how myelin wraps around these neurons and their function here. And we actually would consider a Schwann cell neuroglia. That's a term we have for these. This is just a type of cell that assists in a nerve cell's growth, and nerve cell's function. In the lab, when you look at the structure of nerves and you find nerves, you're going to go through all the nerves in the body. We will see these. If you recall in the muscle lab, you actually saw Schwann cells actually around the neuron that went to the muscle cell you were looking at. So you will see these. And so again, understand their function. Schwann cells in this case are very similar to other cells. They have a nucleus, they have cytoplasm. Yes, they have proteins. It's not drawn here. Similar to other cells, their function though is to assist the neuron. And so when we talk about neurons, understand neurons can have various different roles. And there are dozens of them. We're just going to try to make it real simple for our section of this course. We're basically going to put neurons in 3 categories. One being afferent, sensory neurons. So afferent, think of A as towards the central nervous system. Efferent, E, exiting away from the central nervous system. So motor neurons, they're going to exit from the central nervous system towards muscles, so we call them efferent. Afferent, towards the central nervous system. So if you stub your toe, that impulse that's an afferent impulse. If you want to contract your toe, that is an efferent neuron. And then we also have inner neurons. And these we're not going to get into really much in this class. These are in mostly your spinal cord, in the brain, in the central nervous system. These are kind of intermediary neurons that allow impulses to travel from one neuron to another, to have a role in how information is dealt with and how it's relayed and how we ultimately respond to it. The main 2 we're going to look at are afferent and efferent. When we get to muscles and how they contract, which we've covered previously, that'll be a part of that. And I want you to grasp, when we talk about neurons are very similar to muscles in muscle cells. We have muscle cells, we have nerve cells. But then we have entire muscles, which is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of muscle cells. And we have nerves, which is thousands upon thousands and thousands of neurons. And so think of a nerve. When we think of nerves in our body, our sciatic nerve, our cranial nerve, those are nerves. They are a collection of neurons, much like muscle, that is going to send an impulse, either afferent or efferent in this case, to wherever that information is being relayed. And so when we talk about nerves, especially in lab, you're going to memorize where a lot of the major nerves in the body are. Understand a nerve is just a large structure that has many, many neurons inside of it. Okay, so for our next lecture, what we're going to do, we're going to then go into how does a neuron depolarize. We'll call that the active potential. And that'll be our next lecture. That's going to be a big part of this chapter, so make sure you're reading that. On Canvas, I have a few animations on there that you can look at as well to make a little more sense. So we will cover that in our next lecture.